So you've got the online version of the game. You've got the 3 volumes of the books now. For those that are less familiar, what's the biggest difference between the online game and the book form?
The biggest difference is that the books being something
I'm Aaron Cardell. Today I'm excited to speak with Greg T. Karber, the creator of Murdle. Greg is a mystery writer, computer programmer, and theater veteran who has made a lot of noir and mystery-themed creations, with Murdle being one of his most successful works. Aside from the Murdle daily game and puzzle books, he also has created many games and narrative pieces that evoke thoughtfulness, existential meaning, and philosophical introspection, such as Let Us Climb, The Space Beyond, Philosocratic Games, and more. Murder mystery puzzle game that helps hone your mind and improve your logical thinking. Given a set of clues, weapons, and locations, you have to figure out who had what where, and then which of them is the murderer. The daily Murdles are generated by Morality, a proprietary algorithm capable of planning 1 million murders a minute. Murdle, the book series, is a USA Today and #1 Sunday Times bestseller, as well as won the 2024 British Book Award for Book of the Year. Greg, I'm thrilled you're here.
I'm glad to be here.
Greg, we always like to start out by asking, what's your favorite game to play?
This is both an easy question and also maybe a strange answer, which is absolutely chess is my favorite game to play. And it's something that is not only a kind of a compulsive obsession, but also an object of thought that I just love to return to. I've probably read, 30 books on chess, and it has not made me better at chess, but it has given me this great respect for a game that evolved over such a long period of time into something that is so compelling and so interesting and endlessly rewarding, I think. And frankly, I don't want it to turn into a chess podcast, but I could easily wax poetic about how much I love this game for the rest of it.
Well, that's well said. I'm trying to remember the reference, if it was a podcast I listened to recently, but just kind of really talked about some timeless games and just, some of these classics, it makes you wonder today, like, what are the games of today that are being created today that people 200 years from now may come back to? And chess definitely has a staying power, doesn't it?
There's just something to it. And, chess evolved a lot. Like, originally, I think that early forms of it involved luck. You rolled dice to tell you which piece you had to move. And then for hundreds of years after that, after they removed the dice, there were hundreds of years where the queen was the least powerful piece on the board, where the pawns couldn't move 2 spaces at the beginning, where castling didn't exist. And there was a period a couple hundred years ago, I can't remember exactly when, which they were like, chess is too slow, we got to speed it up. We got to speed chess up. And I just think that's such a modern kind of game design concern that it's funny to see it occurring, I guess, in like the 1600s, just to be sitting around being like, chess is boring, we gotta give it a little extra something,
right?
And truly, the addition of like a powerful queen in chess is, to me, so integral to the game,
that
it is wild to think about that game existing without that, and how much different it was. And I think it's just such a great lesson to game developers, that even if your game is finished for 200 years, there could be something you could add to it that would, really put it over the top.
Yeah, that's great perspective. And it's also interesting thinking about, people however long ago wanting to speed something up. And I compare that now. I'm not as good at chess myself, but one of our co-founders, Nate, he is a little bit addicted to bullet chess, and the number of games he plays that are, minute long, like he finally had to remove it from his phone because it was just so much.
No. I'm actually dealing with the same with the same issue, so to speak. I kind of want to see if I can pull up my chess portfolio or whatever my account, because it is the kind of thing, just like you said, I have played so many bullet chess games. And I got into it because I was really addicted to, I'm always addicted to some mobile game on my phone. Usually they're very, very simple games, something that takes like a minute to play. I was addicted to Flappy Bird. I was addicted to, this was the thing that kind of weirdly pushed me into chess. I was obsessively playing that Super Mario Run iPhone game where you like tap, it's a one tap game to have Mario jump. And I so loved the like, you know, sitting down and you focus in on something and it takes about a minute of your life and it doesn't consume you. But, you know, those minutes add up. And after spending, 6 months getting slowly more obsessed with Super Mario Run, I was just like, this is depressing to me. It's like dispiriting that I'm giving so much of my life to this, very simple game. And I, am embarrassed kind of to be playing it. It's a great game. I highly recommend it. But when you're hooked on, a video game, it says you have to start thinking about what that says about you. And I remember I play this online game called Tag Pro that I really love. It's a browser game. I'm also sort of kind of low-key addicted to it. And it is you roll around as a little red or blue ball, and it's capture the flag, basically. But it's a free-to-play browser game. It's probably 10 or 12 years old at this point. And it's that thing of, like, you can go from not playing a game to being in the middle of one in a minute. And that space, I started to realize, like, wow, I'm spending a lot of my time playing these games. And I started to feel that Tag Pro, as a lot of like online multiplayer games, the player base is not as robust, so to speak, as it was, 8 years ago. And sometimes you can't get a game going. And I was very dispirited by that. And this idea that if you're really into a game that demands some kind of online functionality or other people playing it, you're sort of always vulnerable to, oh, nobody plays that game anymore. Like, it's over for you. And with chess, I was like, okay, people have been playing chess for hundreds of years. They will probably be playing chess hundreds of years from now. If I get hooked on chess, at least it'll be something that makes me seem like a, cultured individual. And it won't be something that time strips away from me. Like, I'll be able to be an old man in the park playing chess in a way that I don't really believe I'll be an old man in the park playing Super Mario Run.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just looked it up too. I have played, and again, I want to stress that I am not good at chess. I have played 44,000 games.
Wow.
Of bullet chess.
That's impressive.
It shouldn't be impressive. A year or two ago, I hired a chess tutor because I was like, I actually want to get good at this game.
Yeah.
And they were like, send me a link to your profile. And I sent it, and she was like, you have played more chess games than I have in my entire life. And she was like, why am I teaching you? And I was like, well, they're all bullet games. And she was like, oh. And she was like, oh no, this is not good. She's like, you need to play longer chess games if you want to get better. But the idea of sitting down and playing, even a 10-minute on each side game, that's half an hour, that doesn't fit into the compulsive play that chess fills in my life. That the moment where you're waiting for 45 seconds and instead of being bored, you play a game of chess. I said I didn't want it to be a chess podcast, but here we are.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned something about chess in the park, and just if I can just lay this out there in full humility, I was traveling with the family last summer, and we found ourselves at a park in, I think it was in Sweden, in Stockholm. And we walk up, there's a chess set outside. Nobody's around. My son and I decided to start playing. And over time, a group of people forms, and they're kind of watching us play. And Greg, the amount of disappointment in these experienced like just even a little bit more experienced players' faces when my son and I kept missing apparently such obvious moves. Yeah, that was motivation for me to try to get better.
People get so good at chess and they so look down on us regular folk. There is a coffee shop near me that is the highest rated chess play in Los Angeles in that kind of, informal environment. And post-pandemic, there's a lot of really great LA chess organizations. I used to go to the LA Chess Club.
Yep.
And it was this really sweet, great chess playing Iranian man who ran it. And it was always like, I was by far the youngest person there who was over the age of 10. So it was old men and like children who, were their like, kids or grandkids.
Wow.
It was such a I don't know what to say, like a very low key environment, lectures on chess that really, I guess nobody else wanted to attend, which I loved though. But post pandemic, the LA Chess Club, the great man who ran that passed away over the pandemic. And there was, a bit of a time when there was no, LA Chess Club. But this woman has started, the LA Chess Club, it has no sort of institutional continuity with the old one. But she's, taken that name upon herself. And it is like a robust, packed crowd of, 50, 60 people every week. It's packed. And chess is like back in a way and is relevant in some sense. I think Queen's Gambit was huge. Someone was telling me that it became, I think a year or two ago, the big middle school craze in America, that like teachers were like, stop playing chess, you've got to stop this. Like that was like the big, like I remember when we were kids, it was like yo-yos were really big for like one semester and everybody had a yo-yo, and one year it was Pokemon cards and it warms my heart so much that it's chess,
Yeah. Well, that's, there could be worse things for a teacher to try to draw a middle schooler away from.
Oh, I was going to say at the coffee shop, and it's great play. Like Hikaru Nakamura sometimes drops by and plays, and there was like some really great chess play there. And I went down there. I didn't realize it was the strongest chess in the city. It was just the closest coffee shop to my house that had chess at it. And I'm playing this game with the guy, and he just immediately destroys me. Like 3-4 moves in, I'm losing. And I make a move, and everybody's like, no, bad, horrible move. And I said, I'm just trying to I know I've lost. I'm just trying to avoid embarrassing myself at this point. And somebody watching goes, too late. And it was just brutal. It was brutal. But it's, it's like a trash-talking coffee shop. And I kind of love that if you like chess, you can play a real buttoned-up, very sophisticated game. You can also go to a coffee shop and get dunked on by your opponent, a man who spends, all of his days doing nothing other than playing chess.
That's great.
And therefore cannot be beaten by any mortal.
It's awesome. Well, we'll shift gears off of chess here, but I love that. Rewind a little bit. Greg, before you got into puzzle making and being a mystery writer, what were you doing?
Well, I was doing a lot of things. To make ends meet, I was working as a ACT, SAT tutor, mostly for like really rich kids, which started out as like a really fulfilling thing, and then over time became something that was like drudgery to me, because I started to sort of question the point of teaching one person how to do better on a standardized test that was curved. I started realizing like everybody I help, it means somebody else's score goes down because these tests are normalized. And that started to distress me. But I do think that the process of tutoring a large number of kids one-on-one and watching them solve problems and figuring out where they got stuck and what they found trivial was hugely helpful in understanding how people's brains work with regard to puzzles. And particularly there's a section on the ACT, the science section, which is really like, should be called something like graphs and charts, or it's really like a kind of reading, comprehension, and deduction sort of section. Science is a sort of a misnomer. They are science papers and experiments, but you're not asked questions that I guess you sort of are expected to kind of understand the process of the scientific method, so to speak.
Sure.
Basically, the way the questions worked are sort of the way that a Murdle works. And I don't think I consciously was pulling this over, and I sort of just realized it as it was coming together, which is that movement of like you have a question or a clue, and then you go to the data set, which in Murdle is the suspects, the characters, the weapons. You figure out what that clue means, and then you go down to the deduction grid in a Murdle, or to the answers in an ACT science section. And that process of like getting a question, looking at the information, figuring out the answer, moving it back to the question, I just found such a compelling gameplay loop, so to speak. And I think that really had I not been doing this tutoring job, I would not have understood that kind of part of the joy of solving a puzzle is really moving your pencil around.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
Is really like going from this thing to that thing to this thing. And that was very helpful. It was also very helpful, too, to understand a concept that I sort of came up with while I was tutoring, which is I would tell kids our brains are oatmeal, because kids always sort of think that they've got it figured out. And once they've got it figured out, their brains are like steel traps, and they will inevitably proceed from the beginning to the end with no mistakes and no errors. And seeing people solve these problems, it's just so often you see, in someone's brain, a 6 becomes a 9, or, this one was bigger than this one becomes that one was bigger than that one in the process of moving it over. And I think that was very helpful as a game developer to sort of have a really realistic view of how people's minds work, because I think it's so easy when you're making a game and you so understand it so fully to forget how overwhelming, a new user interface can be. And maybe it's a little weird to talk about the pages of a book being a user interface, but I definitely thought about it like that, and how you can convey a large amount of information in a way that is clear and that tells people where to go when, what to look at, what you can look at first and then ignore, what you need to really study. And it was very helpful. But before I was doing Murdle creatively, I ping-ponged around between a bunch of different things. And I, like you mentioned, I made little philosophical games with a little guy that took excerpts of philosophical works that I liked and tried to dramatize it in some sense. And then I made that game Let Us Climb, where you play a little head of lettuce that tries to roll and bounce your way to the top of a procedurally generated mountain. And I made a collection of bite-sized horror games at bitesizedhorror.com, which I'm not 100% sure is still up. But they were all sort of, I would have random small ideas. I would get very excited by that small idea. And then I would make that small idea. And if it worked well, I'd do 4 or 5 more of them until I had sort of been creatively exhausted. And then I would move on to the next one. And because of that, my portfolio, so to speak, was very scattershot and very unfocused. And when I was asked to describe who I was in like a biography, or like send us your, your biographical paragraph or whatever, I never could figure out what to do or what to say. And so a couple of years ago, I sat down and I decided that I needed to focus very specifically on interactive murder mysteries. And I was going to only make a project if it felt like sort of a golden age Agatha Christie mystery with some sort of modern interactive twist to it. And I planned out, 20 different ones of these, basically. And Murdle was the first one. And I expected to move on the next week to the next one. And then immediately Murdle kind of took off. And it wasn't like it became really big all of a sudden, but it immediately, people really responded to it in a way that, if you're a creator, we've all had the experience of spending, years on something and then releasing it to people, and they're all like, yeah, it's okay, and it can be devastating. But for this, people really responded to it well. And I remember the first week after it came out, I sent out a poll to all of the new email subscribers, and I said, okay, what should I work on next? Should I make this? Should I make this? Should I make this? And one of them was like, keep improving Murdle. And that was like the 80% answer, that I should focus on expanding and extending this brand more.
Sorry, just a quick question there. Was that a multiple choice thing, or did people just they told you that?
No, it was multiple choice, but there was 12 options, and then there was a like other blank. But I had this whole series of things. I have a horror comedy musical that I have co-written and co-directed, and I've been editing for years, and it just takes forever to make a movie. I would say even more than to make a video game. I don't know. They're both Herculean. But with a movie, there are so many tasks that can't be made smaller. You can make a small video game, but you can't really make a small feature film. Like, there's a certain... But, so I listed all of these projects that I've had some idea of in my list, and people just wanted more Myrtle. And I give the people what they want. If people tell me they want me to do something, then that's what I'll do.
That's great. Well, a couple of callbacks from things you just said. So you mentioned you're not even sure if Bite-Sized Horror Games is still up. That is at looks like bitesizedhorror.com is still up. You mentioned talk of a movie. That's different though than Killer Party, the musical.
No, that's the one. Yeah, that's the one.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so killerpartymusical.com if you want to check that out.
And that's really just what do you call it? Like a stub, like a landing page. And that's something that we have worked on forever, but in our spare time and with spare money and without, now if you see a movie at the end of the film, there's like 5,000 people who are involved in the film. And I always remember being like, who are all of these people? And now I'm like, oh yeah, you need about 1,000 people to make a movie. That's about how many you should have. And, I also think now, like I remember as a kid, they would announce some big film, they'd be like, they're going to make a Superman movie. And they'd be like, and it's coming out in 5 years. And I remember as a kid being like, why is it taking so long? And now when they say a movie's coming out in 5 years, I'm like, good luck.
Yeah. Wow.
I hope it goes smoothly. Yeah.
Oh man, that sounds onerous. That's a whole different word.
I don't mean to just come onto the podcast and talk about how much work everything is, though. It is making games, and I think all mysteries are games in a way, even if it's just a book that you just read normally. There's a mental game that you're playing of trying to figure out who done it. Making games is, to me, the most fun thing in the world. It's the most rewarding thing in the world. So as much as sometimes I'll gripe about the effort involved, I certainly wouldn't trade it for any of the other forms of labor that are out there.
Absolutely. And I think, back to an earlier point of yours, I think there's something, I'm going to say magical, and I feel like that's overkill, but there's something magical about even like the daily game genre of, like you mentioned earlier, like there's something about these games that feel like they occupy so much of our time, but there's something about the daily game where it's just sort of like, we know that people are getting bite-sized, not to steal that, but bite-sized pieces of a game, and it can just be a fun daily enjoyment, and it doesn't need to be more than that.
Right. I mean, and this gets into the thing I was talking about with my compulsive habits with games. I really wanted to make sure with Murdle that I wasn't making something that would addict people in a bad way. Mm-hmm. I am very sort of conscientious of that. I don't want to be in a position where I'm making something in people's lives that they start to resent, or that starts to represent a part of themselves that they, need to work on, you know? I don't want to be the game that you play when you should be going to bed and then you tired the next day at work or school and it's your life is collapsing and your parents are going, so you got to stop playing it, And that concept of like you can only play it once a day, to me is just so enriching because it allows you to have a relationship with players that is not, you're not trying to like gobble up every moment of their lives. You're not trying to figure out how you can hook them for another 2-3 hours every day. You're trying to provide something that gives them, kind of a soothing ritual, kind of a gentle joy every day. And one of the things that I really love about Murdle is, I guess, inherently kind of a single player experience. It's something that a lot of people do communally.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Either they compete with each other. Sometimes I say when people come up to me about Myrtle, they always have two ways of working on them with friends or their partner. Some people work on them together and they go through the clues together and they figure out what it means. And some people each have their own book or their own, phone pulled up and they race each other and it's competitive. And I've always kind of wondered, do one of those people have, stronger relationships? I've always suspected that maybe the competitors are maybe healthier than the collaborators. But I don't know. I don't know. And I just love that people can come to it in different ways.
Yeah.
That there's something really great about a puzzle. And this is the first true like puzzle game that I've made. That's not true. I'm realizing I have made some puzzle games in the past. But this one was the first puzzle game that I've made that really took off. And it's just been so delightful to see how people interact with it differently and they choose their own ways to interact with it. As opposed to, with most games, video games, I should say, there's kind of, I shouldn't say most, I don't want to exaggerate, but a lot of games there is like a way that you interact with it and you play the experience that the creator provided to you. And I think there's a great thing with puzzles that, everybody goes about them differently. Some people, ask friends for help. Some people race friends. Some people cheat. Some people, don't finish them, just kind of read through it and, challenge themselves a little and then move on. And I'm just very happy to provide something that people can come to on their own terms like that. And not something that like dictates how you should experience it.
How much of that do you think? So there were some things you shared about, wanting to focus on a specific genre and having 20 ideas to pursue. And then, some of the maybe specific things that you appreciate about Myrtle on this side of it. But how much of that do you think you realized on the other side of it, creating it, and how much of it was did you feel like was intentional from the outset?
It's a great question because I think a lot of times you make something very intuitively and then when it's over, you talk about it as if you made these very conscious choices that really only revealed themselves to you after you had made them, I think that for Myrtle, I had a huge asset, which was that I made the first one when I was procrastinating on a writing project. And I made it like on a napkin for a friend. I like took a picture of it and sent it to him while I was at a coffee shop. And he really liked it. But that one was a very simple puzzle. It didn't have the characters. It didn't have the like funny descriptions. But I continued to send this one friend drafts of the game as I developed it further. And I really only got his feedback until it was something like 90% done. And I think that was so crucial to it working. That is the thing that I feel I most consciously try to recommend to people, is to make a game or anything for like a single person in your life that And I'm not saying only don't get feedback from other people. That was a particular thing for Myrtle that I think I kind of lucked out on. But I previously made a lot of these games imagining a wide audience or an imaginary audience. And you don't really know what an imaginary audience will like. You imagine they'll like whatever you're making, but you don't really know. And it's so easy to convince yourself that some idea is going to be beloved. And then when you actually put it in front of people, they're like, it's pretty good. I like it. Yeah. And making this for one person and sort of adjusting and modifying it and changing it based on how this one friend reacted to it was so clarifying. And he was particularly a kind of person, like I sent him the first puzzle, not like, what do you think about this as a model for a new game and brand that I'll spend the next 3 years of my life focusing on? But as like, here's a fun puzzle. Do you like this? And I think that was so crucial that it came about as something that I made for a friend and not as something that had this, like corporate plan behind it. But initially it wasn't called Murdle, and it wasn't a daily game because that trend hadn't really emerged yet. And it was through the sort of emergence of this genre that blew up of daily games that kind of made the clear connection to this. It just seemed like such a perfect fit for this project. I think initially the plan was that you would solve 5 in a row that would get progressively harder. And you could play those 5. You could play a random 5 over and over and over again, but it would always be the same 5 mystery story. And the realization that it would be better as a daily game was just really the final piece that clicked in, and that I feel like really shaped how the book was structured too. Now, obviously you can do more than one a day, but it made me realize the value not in creating this kind of progressive ladder of puzzles, but in creating a singular experience of one puzzle that you could do over and over again. And I think that was really key too. I think as a writer, when I was developing the book, I really wanted to make all of the puzzles build on each other and to reference each other, and for it to be one sort of unitary, mega puzzle. And my editor at St. Martin's Press, Courtney Littler, who's a genius, she supervises the publication of the New York Times puzzle books. And she just had this awareness that people want to do the same puzzle that they're familiar with over and over again. And that rather than try to build this progressive ladder of puzzle complexity, what we should try to do is create one really great puzzle experience that then we can provide over and over again. And even though I think in practice, these two models don't seem that different, like we still made a book where there's a storyline that runs through them all. They still do get harder. They still do build on the techniques of previous puzzles. But the frame shift from one massive thing to one thing 100 times was just so important in understanding how people actually engage with it. And I think allowed it to be something that people like say to me, oh, I do one every night before bed. Or, I do one on my lunch break. And that to me is so rewarding versus all I ever do is sit here and solve these puzzles, and I don't sleep.
So you, well, first off, I just want to highlight the insight there of make it for one person first. I think in a lot of startup circles, there's a lot of talk about like really trying to niche down your product offering to start out with and thinking about like the smallest cohort of people to create it for. But I don't think it's often that people say just make it for one person. And I think that's actually really insightful.
Yeah, that is a little bit, I'm ripping off a bit. There is a list of, Kurt Vonnegut wrote Tips for Writers. And he says something like that about stories. And he has a line in it. He's a brilliant writer, so he says it a lot better than I do. But he says something like, if you try to open a window for your story, it'll catch a cold. And it's sort of this idea that the wider audience you're trying to appeal to in your mind, the less specific the work ends up being. And it's so easy, I think, when you have an idea, to have an idea that you really don't love, but you love and you really aren't suited for, but you love the fantasy of being the person that made that idea. I think there's a lot of people who write scripts that they're not the right person to write this script. The script is not the stories that they're interested in, but they have a fantasy that this will be the thing that blows up and wins them an Oscar and makes $1 billion. And they start to write less for the people who are watching the movie and more for how they're going to talk about it when they accept the Academy Award for Best Movie Ever Made.
Yeah.
And that, I know that happens to me. I write a thing and I start to get really excited with how I'll be treated when people read this thing. And I think it's just so destructive to the experience of actually receiving the thing when you can feel that this writer is trying to make themselves sound cool, and I also think that another thing that I really kind of strangely benefited from is that I don't really obsess over puzzles. I'm not a puzzle fiend. The guy I was making these puzzles for goes to a incredibly competitive trivia night once a week where everybody at the bar has won a game show. It's the hardest trivia in Los Angeles. And those people make puzzles that hurt your brain. And I think this happens whenever you're into something really deeply. You're like people who really love, whiskey. They want to drink, the most disgusting beverage you've ever tasted. If you don't like whiskey, if you're not a drinker, people who love coffee don't like a mocha latte. They love sipping an espresso. And I think that sometimes that can be really alienating when you make stuff and you're like, what do you think about this coffee? And they're like, it tastes bitter. It tastes horrible. And you're like, I know, it's the best in the world. And I think that really benefited me because I came to it from a perspective of someone who wasn't so deep into it that I had lost the sense of charm and joy of a neophyte.
Yeah, well said. Well said. Well, to speak to just some of the mechanics of Murdle a little bit more, a couple of things that piqued my interest. So we talked about the puzzles being generated through an algorithm, and you can plan 1 million murders a minute. But the game strike, I get conceptually how a game like Sudoku is computer generated or is often computer generated. It seems like there's a lot going on with Murdle. Can you tell me more about just the algorithmically generated side of that?
Yeah, I would love to. And I'm actually really excited to be on a game developer podcast and talking about this because a lot of times if I get into this with a book interview, people, glaze over. But it is not unsimilar to a Sudoku. I did not know how to generate puzzles when I started this. If I were to do it all over again, the architecture of a Murdle the generation would probably function in a very different way. So I'm just going to go through how the Murdle daily generator works, and I'll just kind of describe the steps of it. And I think I can go over it pretty quickly. And I'll speak to what I spent time on working, which is that, so this is kind of inside baseball, technical details. But basically what it does is it starts and it randomly selects the suspects and weapons and locations. Now, the weapons and locations are taken from a very large data set of mega locations, which each have weapons and sublocations associated with them. All of this is, handwritten, so to speak. So I would think of a location, I would think of, 10 different sublocations that could be there, 10 different weapons that could be found there. And I would just type this all up in an enormous spreadsheet. And the same thing with the suspects. I just have a large pool of suspects that I generated or that I wrote for the thing. So every day it randomly chooses a set of weapon suspects locations, and it uses as a random seed the day, the date. And then everything is deterministically randomly generated from that seed. So when you visit Murdle.com, your computer generates a Murdle individually. Now, if I would have started all over again, I'd probably do that server side and just send out the puzzle to each person, because sometimes if someone's on like an old iPhone, it takes it a long time to generate the puzzle. And also, I don't have any ability inherently to maintain like a large archive of them because they are ephemerally generated every day based on the seed.
Yeah.
And when I modify the program, ostensibly you could pull up any previous puzzle, but when I modify the code, it changes not only today's puzzle, but every puzzle in the future and every puzzle in the past.
Yeah.
Okay, so once it's chosen the weapon suspects locations, it then chooses who has what, where, for all of them, and then it selects a murderer. And then it generates a random series of clues that accurately describe this circumstance. So it randomly selects things that are just true. So and so has such and such is over there. Or it'll include even either ors, either this is true or that's true. And it just creates a series of true statements about that puzzle. And I found out about how many would be needed to come to a unique answer simply by trial and error, by doing it, 1,000 times. And then what it does, after it's chosen a random set of statements, it then checks to see in every single possible arrangement of suspect weapon location that this is a unique solution. And I had an intuition, which I have not mathematically proved, but I have found to be true from a couple years' experience now, that if there were a single solution to the puzzle, then that solution would be logically reachable. It's not necessarily true that you could have a Sudoku with one solution and that people could naturally get to that solution through a logical process. Sometimes there's puzzles where there is only one solution, but there's a real gulf between what you've got and that answer. And you don't want to create a puzzle where there's a lot of, random guessing and checking. You want there to be some sort of process that people can do as they work through it. So then it generates all the true statements. It checks through every possibility if there's only one solution. And on Saturdays and Sundays, this is, I think 12 million possibilities or something. So it sometimes takes a little computational legwork. And then once it's found that there's only one solution, it goes through all of the statements and it tries to remove them one at a time. And it removes each statement and then it checks to see, is there still only one solution? Because in early puzzles, there were frequently redundant clues. And that is aesthetically, there's nothing gameplay breaking about that, but it's aesthetically not that satisfying if the clues are repetitive. And it also checks when it's creating these clues to make sure that the what I call the killer clue, which is the final clue that says, where the crime was committed or what weapon it was committed with, it makes sure that that weapon and that location aren't mentioned in any of the other clues. So that you have to do a couple of clues to solve the puzzle, because again, early puzzles sometimes, it'd be like clue 1, Dame Obsidian had the angry moose. And then clue 2, the angry moose committed the crime. And you'd be like, well, I've cracked this one. It would be, you want to have some level of difficulty. And then once it's found all of the statements, now I should say what a statement is at this juncture in the code is not a full sentence. It is simply the logical arrangement. It's, whether someone has something, what something, where something is, that sort of stuff. A brown-haired suspect was here. a heavyweight weapon was there. Then it runs it through what took a huge amount of labor, which is basically just a long series of murder mystery-esque English language sentences which express those relationships in a kind of Mad Lib style. So it'll plop in the weapon or the suspect into places in those sentences. And this, I think, is really where the game kind of comes into itself, is that if the clues were just like, Dame Obsidian had the angry moose, I think it would get kind of boring. But because the clues are expressed in these various, like, evocatively mysterious ways, they add a level of interest. And then, after that's done, some of the clues are taken and further codified. So, for example, there's little codes and ciphers, and those are added to it as a final step. Now, then it all, displays for the user, and I think that's pretty much it. I think that's the system. Now, it's more technically convoluted on the puzzles with liars, but it basically is the same process, that it checks to make sure there's only one unique solution, and it reverse engineers the clues to match that single solution. That's a pretty long answer to that question, but I hope that we've provided.
Well, that's great. I love the detail, and I think a lot of our listeners will too.
Yeah, I would say, I'm so sorry. Real quick, I want to say, I'm so sorry. You're going to say, but I wish that I had done it in the way that a logical solver would do it, which is that it would create a clue and then deduce things from that clue. Because then I could have more control over the difficulty level of a particular puzzle. Whereas the current system, although it creates solvable puzzles all the time, there's a range of difficulties that I can only check after the fact.
Yep.
And that would be, so if people, when you said people are going to find it very interesting, I wanted to say, like, if you're making a randomly generated puzzle, if you actually teach the computer the logic of deductions versus my system of brute force, testing, you will have more control over the ultimate difficulty level of the puzzle.
Yep.
I'm so sorry to jump in that.
No. That's well stated. And honestly, like everything you just said, I've, made a Kakuro generator and solver. I've been involved with Sudoku generators and solvers. And I think anybody who's spent any time, on these puzzle generators and solvers, there's so many, analogous things of what you just shared of what works and doesn't work with those too. So it's really cool to hear you share that.
The fact that, like, when we were making the book, I realized at some point that I had completely lost the ability to solve these puzzles, because all of the way that I thought about it was in this really computer way of solving it. Like, oh no, I just check every single possible solution and verify whether it's accurate. Like, that's not how regular people solve them. And I think that's a really weird, I've never felt this phenomena so strongly, which is present in all game design, where, like, you see the code, they only see the output. But for this, it was doubly strange, because the code that I'm seeing is actually, like, an alternative way to solve the puzzles that caused my actual way to solve the puzzles to, what do you call it, like, decay. Like, I don't know what you say when someone becomes very weak over time, like a muscle that you don't exercise.
Yeah.
I can't remember the word.
Atrophy, maybe.
Atrophy. I feel like my ability to solve Murdles in a human way has atrophied. And I also think, this is a thing I said on Let Us Climb. I watched a speed run of Let Us Climb, and the guy was so much better at the game than I was. And I felt at that time that was what I measure as success in game development, which is that you spend so much time playing your game and you understand it so deeply that when the game comes out, you are the greatest player of this game that exists on Earth. And I truly feel that I have been successful as a game developer when one person is better at the game than I am.
Oh, totally.
Because it just is so astounding to see someone who didn't, as in Let Us Climb, like minutely tweak the physics of the head of lettuce for 6 months, and has a deep understanding of what jumps can be made and what techniques can be done. Just to see someone intuitively be better at that, or it was just truly astounding, and it's such a rewarding thing for a game developer.
No, that's one of the highest honors, right? Is that's great. So just otherwise, you've got the online version of the game. You've got the 3 volumes of the books now. What's for those that are less familiar, what's the biggest difference between the online game and the book form?
The biggest difference is that the books, being something I handmade, so to speak, are, robustly tested and balanced, and each puzzle is very unique. But primarily the difference is the story. So there's a narrative that runs through each of the Murdle books. And the first one really tells this story between these 2 detectives, Logico and Iratino, and this big crime that connects all of the cases. And there's cliffhangers, and there's, recurring bits, and there's characters that change over the course of the book. A great way to have story is to just have those descriptions of the characters change each time you encounter them. So one of the characters in the second book is a castaway who's taken off this island, and then every time she appears for the rest of the book, she's trying to find herself. So she has like a different persona she's adapted. And that experience of being able to play with a story over a course of 100 puzzles is so rewarding to me, and I hope it's rewarding to people reading it, to feel like they're really immersed in it. Whereas the daily puzzle is very much a daily activity. It's something that, is much more akin, I would say, to, doing the mini crossword or doing a daily Sudoku, where there is character. There are, interesting worlds and characters and locations, but you don't get the sense of a story. And that's actually something that I want to add more to the site. I want to add more procedural story. I love procedural story generation. But, I just finished the 4th adult Murdle, and I just finished a Murdle Junior for kids that's going to come out in October and November in the UK and the US. And we're going to have a series of Murdle Junior novels for 8 to 12-year-olds where kid detectives solve crimes. And I have just been so overwhelmed with all these other things. We've got a jigsaw puzzle that's going to be coming out. We've got a board game coming out pretty soon. And the one sort of regret I have with all of this, not really a regret, but is that I feel like I need to be working more on the daily puzzle experience. And there's just something I love so fundamentally deeply about making websites and making a thing that is accessible everywhere in the world to any single person, that I've always loved. When I was like 12 or 13, my father read an article about how, people were buying domain names and creating websites, and he reserved a domain name for our family and was like, Gregory, you got to create a website. And I got into making websites like at 12, I think. And, at the time that was pretty cutting edge. And now the open web is something that I think I have a real nostalgia for. The internet before social media and before apps. And I loved those like random weird websites that you would discover, in some far forgotten corner of the internet. I loved the time when, if you wanted to learn about a TV show that you liked, you wouldn't go to, Wikipedia. You would go to like, Dave's Seinfeld page, and you'd only have the information about Seinfeld that Dave had put together. And if he really was obsessed with Kramer, like that website was a Kramer focused website. And I just so love that world of GeoCities and of individual hobbyist creators, that's something that's really important to me about Myrtle and something I really love about it. And I want to really sit down and spend, 2-3 months really like pouring, 2.0 into the Myrtle website and incorporating a lot of the stuff that I've learned from making these books into the site. Because right now it really, I think, functions in large part as like a free sample for the Myrtle books. And I want to make it a little more robust. But I would say that there is something to the like, I think in tech or startups, it's like minimum viable product. There's really something to figuring out how you can make something that works, that's self-contained, that's enjoyable, and then not spending an extra 5 years trying to make it, the new World of Warcraft or, this massive thing. Like, how can you get something, finished, but small? I just had some friends who are great screenwriters, and over the pandemic, they wanted to make a video game. And I was like, whatever your scope is, have it, and then have it again, and then have it again. You want to create the smallest scope game you can possibly imagine. And, within 2 weeks, they're like trying to model the economy of the countries in their game. And I'm like, you guys, you're never going to finish.
Yeah. Can you speak a little bit to the popularity of the game? I know you've got a ton of players. Is there anything you're able to share in terms of number of daily or monthly daily players?
I don't know the exact number of players, but I think we get about 1 million plays a month on the site. And that is varied and is downstream from the success of the books. So Christmas was huge in the UK. We were the #1 book for Christmas last year.
How does it feel to, by the way, be the third non-British author to achieve that?
Unbelievable. I mean, I am like the unanswerable third person in that trivia question. Like, if you ask someone, who are the 3 authors, the non-British authors that have had a British Christmas #1? The other 2, I'm sure, are Michelle Obama and Dan Brown. And I feel like a wise trivia audience could perhaps guess those 2. but 10 years from now, mine's going to be a hard one to answer, I think. But, I mean, I don't know. Maybe Myrtle will be the most obvious answer of all, But truly wild, because I loved, as a kid, British mysteries, Agatha Christie. I mean, there's so many wonderful, but just that whole world of the like manor house mystery, the detectives, the aristocratic suspects. It was really a love letter to that whole genre, and to see it succeed so well in the UK was such an honor. And it's really overwhelming too, because it's not like, when you sell a book, they're like, well, how many followers do you have? Can you post about this a lot? Can you? And I didn't really have a lot of followers. I didn't really have what they call a platform, and so it really was the book itself that went out there and that did well. And it's so deeply flattering, and I feel more like a custodian of it than a creator. I think that my job now is to just try to, take care of it as much as I can and honor this relationship that people have with it, rather than, think of it as something that I'm like making, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, that's inspiring. And you can just say you and Michelle Obama are besties.
No, it's truly unbelievable. I don't really know how. Sometimes people are like, oh, how does it feel? I'm like, I have no idea. I have no idea how it feels. I don't know. It's very bizarre. I think in like 10 years, I'll look back on this and I'll probably think like, oh, I wish I had enjoyed that more than working constantly. But I do love working constantly. So I don't know. Maybe I will have no regrets at all. I'm not sure.
Well, so it seems like this is, obviously you've got a lot of irons in the fire. You're looking to make a movie, but it seems like Myrtle's kind of your main passion right now and line of work. I'm curious with, a million daily puzzles solved online. Is there a reason you haven't, put ads on the website and maybe had a opportunity to drive some revenue that way?
This gets in a little bit to that thing I was talking about with the allure of the old internet, which is that, websites used to not constantly be trying to trick you. And I mean, there were pop-ups and there were ads from the very beginning, but I've always wanted to make something that felt like it was, innocent or pure in some sense. And I've always kind of felt like even putting like a Google Ads banner at the top maybe eats away at that experience a little and makes it feel a little bit like, something that is trying to take advantage of you in some sense. I mean, not that, I would never begrudge anybody running ads or I think that I've been very fortunate with Myrtle in that it is monetizable as a book and as like a board game and as these other things, that I've been able to think of the website as kind of a community hub, sort of a lost leader, so to speak. And it's something that I'm not super concerned about making sure that I get, every penny off of it that I can. But in trying to use it, rather than selling, whatever product the individual user has most recently Googled, trying to only use it to promote Myrtle, to promote the books, to promote upcoming the board game, things like that. I think about it a lot like church. I don't really go to church now, but as a kid in Arkansas, I would go to Sunday school, and you'd go to church afterwards, and the preacher he does try to get you to donate to the church, right? They will be like, yeah, we're raising money for this mission, or we're trying to build a new building or whatever, but he never sells the time at the pulpit to a business,
yeah, right.
I guess
today's sermon brought to you by
yeah. And I feel like if you did that, if you got up there and said like, Best Buy's offering a 15% sale to all congregants, there would be a sense of like, oh, you're kind of misusing our time here. And I just want to, as much as possible, bring that kind of respect to it.
Sure.
Although some preachers out there listening to this podcast being like, wait a second.
Yeah, right. New revenue stream unlocked.
Yeah. And that being said, I mean, if maybe I'll revisit this in a couple years when I start looking at if I need to, buy a car or something. My car breaks down. If you see ads on the Myrtle website, it'll mean my car broke down. So, well,
as somebody who may have some game websites with some ads on them, I will have zero judgment later. If
oh well, I mean, this is the thing. Like Let Us Climb was a game that was not nearly as successful as Myrtle, but was pretty popular. But there's no real way, or at least that I could see, to easily like sell a subsidiary product to that. Like I think Myrtle, because it's a printable puzzle, by pure random chance happened to be something that there were ways to economically present it to people, and I think that I was fortunate in that. So being able to be like, yeah, I'm not going to run ads because I sell this book is like really from a place of kind of
it works.
Privilege. Yeah.
It works. No, and I think it's well thought out and it works well.
I also, in the very same way that I get addicted to games, get addicted to like checking analytics And I have had times before where I've made web projects that the amount of time I spend working on it begins to be dwarfed by the amount of time I spend thinking about how to increase user retention or, checking how many viewers right now. More than yesterday, fewer than yesterday. Why is that? Or what should I change? And it's a sort of obsessive habit that I try to suppress in myself, because it doesn't lead to creative exploration. It leads to this sort of strange rumination on whatever numbers Google tells me.
Yeah. No, I can get locked in like that as well. Totally relate.
It starts out, it feels so good, especially you get a good day, you're like, oh, the numbers are so good. And then, you get a bad day and you're like, the numbers are so bad. And at some point, it feels like you're like stepping on a scale, every morning, and you're devastated if it's bad and you're overjoyed if it's good. And it has nothing to do with your general enjoyment of life. It's like a metric that you've started to focus on. And again, I think that making something for a friend was such a better way for me to healthily work on something than trying to reverse engineer from analytics and data what the market would, most appreciate.
Totally. So what are maybe some of the influences or some of the precursors, if you will, in terms of leading up to how you think about creating some of these games?
Yeah, I think that something that has been really great about the games that I've made is that they usually come first from some non-game inspiration. So like the Let Us Climb game that we talked about I was writing these daily short cones, and it was weirdly like kind of a video game adaptation of that story. And I did a couple of those around that project. And with Murdle, it was, like I love these Agatha Christie Golden Age mysteries. There's a guy, John Dixon Carr, who wrote maybe the greatest locked room mystery of all time. It's called The Three Coffins, sometimes released as The Hollow Man. And these old mysteries were games. There's a Chesterton quote where he says that detective fiction is the grandest game in the world. And it's a challenge that you lay out for the reader. And then they solve it, hopefully, a few pages before the detective. And it's this real great experience of feeling like you see how all the pieces snap into place. And I really loved that experience. And I used to love, as a kid, these logic puzzles. But the logic puzzles were always like, the man in the blue hat drove a red car. The man in the green hat lived in a yellow house. And they were just so devoid of any kind of narratively interesting material. And I think that, in fact, there's a famous one that people call the Einstein puzzle, where I think you have to find out people's house, you have to find out maybe what car they drive, and then one of the things is what brand of cigarettes they smoke. And that just, I feel like, is the most hilarious, like, dated aspect of that puzzle. Like, it's so clearly from the 1950s because it's a children's puzzle that wants you to figure out who smokes Camels. But I think that taking those influences or inspirations that are outside the world of games is such a fundamental part of my process, I guess, where it's not that I play a game and I'm like, I want to make this game. Because, like, I love Stardew Valley. That guy made that game by himself. And I could not imagine being able to make Stardew Valley alone. Like, the complexity, the depth of that game, it's a different mind than I have. And I am much more of like a small projects guy. And so I think something about being inspired by a book or inspired by a short story or a poem or another world and making a game out of that has, for me, produced more satisfying things than trying to make like my own version of Stardew Valley. Or like what I was obsessed about as a kid was making a Zelda game on my calculator. And it's just like, you're never going to make a better Zelda than Zelda. Like, it's tough. And if you are, you know that you are, because you're someone who their whole life has been obsessed with Zelda and with that, world, and then the game that you make channels everything that you've ever loved about it. And I would say that to me is like a key thing for me. It's like, are you the best person in the world to make this thing?
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds kind of like wildly egotistical to ever claim that you're the best person in the world to make a particular thing. But like, if you frame that in the right way, like me making Murdle for my friend, like nobody else was going to be able to make a murder mystery logic puzzle for my friend better. Like, I was so perfectly suited to make this for this one person. I'd read so many mysteries. I'd loved puzzles, but I was also making it for someone who I knew and knew what they liked. And it was very different than trying to, like, make the new commercial success, which I just, is so difficult and so random.
Well, it's I'm sure inspiring for a lot of our listeners, just to hear more about your journey here. Greg, this has been a real joy for me. If you want people to find you online, where should they look?
Yeah, so you can follow me on Instagram at Greg Karber. It gets Karber, B as in boy, ER. But also just go to Murdle.com, Murdle.com. You can play a daily murder mystery logic puzzle. And then my information is on that site. So if you want to, cyber stalk me, you can start there.
Excellent. Well, thanks so much, Greg. We really appreciate your time.
No, thank you so much for having me. I loved it.